And thank you for attending this event sponsored by the Society of Professional Journalists New England chapter. My name is Danielle Ibarra. I'm one of the at-large directors on the national board, and I am so excited to moderate tonight's conversation with Carole Simpson. Simpson's career in broadcast journalism spans decades. 15 of those years she spent as an anchor of the weekend editions of ABC's World News Tonight. And in 1992, Carole became the first woman and first person of color to moderate a presidential debate. She was also the first Black woman to broadcast news in her hometown of Chicago, the first to anchor a local TV newscast, the first to become a national network correspondent, the first to anchor a major network newscast. During her illustrious career, Simpson won 3 Emmys, a Peabody Award, a DuPont Columbia Journalism Award, a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Washington Press Club, and 14 honorary degrees. And she's also an NABJ Hall of Famer, and of course, an SPJ Fellow of the Society, and she was inducted in 1994. We could go on and on, but we only have an hour, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Carole, and also happy belated birthday. I know your birthday was last week, right?
Do you know that?
Did a little Googling.
Last Wednesday.
Well, happy birthday.
Thank you. I was born on Pearl Harbor Day.
Yeah. So I guess the most basic question is, what made you want to become a journalist in the first place?
I didn't think of it at all until I went to high school in Chicago, which is my hometown. And I had an English teacher that thought I wrote very well. And she said, why don't you join the high school newspaper? And see if you like that. And so they made me the correspondent for the homerooms. My job was to go around to all the homerooms and get the news out of there, who won this and what kid was applying for what school, just all the kind of minutia that you would have in high school. But it was my job to put it together, and then I would write it up, and then my name was the byline. And I really enjoyed it because I found out things first before anybody else in the school knew about it. I was interviewing the teachers and the principal and the students. So I knew it first, and then it was my job to filter it down for the readers. And so I really liked that. And I had been reading newspapers from the time I was about 3. I wasn't really reading them, but I was sitting in my dad's lap, and he would read the Sunday funnies to me. And I guess the warmth of being in his lap and the fun of having him read these things to me really stuck with me, because later I wanted to read to him. And when I got older and could read, I would read the newspaper to him. So I had this affinity for newspapers, but never thought of a career in it until high school, and seeing that byline, seeing that people knew who I was in that school and they had to talk to me. So I decided to apply to journalism school at Northwestern University, which is in Evanston, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. And I had great grades. I had a B+ average, and I was in everything: student government and the choir and the newspaper and the honor society. And so I had all the credentials you would think that Northwestern would want for a student to come there. And I went to the admissions office and campus and met with one of the admissions counselor, and he said, I don't think you should think about coming here because you have 3 strikes against you. You're Black. At that time he was saying Negro. I was a Negro, and I was a woman, and I was inexperienced. I hadn't had any experience other than the high school newspaper. Well, I thought that's what most everybody else applying would have. So I was very disappointed, and I was so crestfallen when I left that interview. And sure enough, a few weeks later, I got this letter saying, we regret to inform you that you're not coming to Northwestern. And he had told me, you ought to go to Chicago Teachers College and become a nice English teacher. That's more your speed. And that was the first no that I got, that I could not do this job, that I could not be in this profession, and that things like my sex and my color were preventing me from doing that. And that wasn't right. My young indignation, that isn't fair. I knew I had the qualifications. So that no was the first of many I would get throughout my career. And I say throughout because it continued all the way until my 50s and 60s of people saying I couldn't do certain things because of who I was. So that became like a vitamin pill that I took. When he said no, I couldn't do it. It was my desire to show that I could do it. And I finally got accepted at the University of Michigan and majored in journalism there. But again, the job, when I tried to get a job after college, same thing. I was Black, I was female, and I didn't have any worthwhile experience. So it was tough going. And as I say, it only made me want to be a journalist all the more. I just couldn't believe that people would stop me because of who I was, that I couldn't do anything about my color or my sex. So that was the beginning of a lifelong and career-long battle to prove people wrong, my attempt to prove them wrong, that I could do these things and I could excel at it.
And I was going to say, I mean, those two things, they've followed you in your career and sometimes they've helped and hurt you. And we're going to talk more about that in a second. But you, like you mentioned, it was tough for you to try to find a job right after college, but you ended up in Alabama in the segregated South, right? Talk about what that was like.
Oh my God. I grew up in Chicago. I had gone to integrated schools. And so going to the South, going to a small, rural, all Black town in Alabama was such a culture shock for me, leaving the big city of Chicago. And it was segregated then. You know, young people today, I don't think understand what that meant. I mean, it was awful. And I was, you know, in the cocoon of the Black college, but it was when I left the Black college to go shopping or something like that, that I came face to face with segregation, which I hadn't understood in the North until I went South. If I wanted a dress, needed to buy clothes, I would have to go to Montgomery, Alabama. And in the only department store in the town, Black women were not allowed to try on clothes. You had to hold it up against you and see if it would fit you, but you couldn't try it on. Now, I understand other stores had Black dressing rooms and white dressing rooms, but there was no dressing room for colored people in Montgomery, Alabama. We couldn't try on a hat. And of course, in the South, everybody wears hats. Summertime, you need it for the sun. You needed it to go to church. Everybody went to church, but we couldn't try on a hat because they said our hair was greasy and would ruin the hats. So you couldn't, which was certainly untrue. I don't really know any Black woman that was down there that had a greasy head that would mess up a hat. There was one movie theater in the county, and Black people were not allowed to sit on the first floor. We had to climb up into the balcony. You weren't allowed to get concessions because those were on the first floor. So you had to bring your popcorn and your whatever. And it was filthy. They never cleaned it. So it was nasty. And I was just like, this is incredible. I would have white men yell obscenities to me out of their car windows, and it would refer to sexual parts of a woman. And I just had never been treated like that before. When I tried to go back home and take the bus to Atlanta, I had to wait in a colored waiting room. And after a while, I said, I'm not waiting in there. So I wouldn't even go in there. I would sit by, you know, outside on the platform and wait for the train, but not go into that humiliating colored waiting room. So I was there when the civil rights movement was at its height. It was 61, 62. The freedom rides were going on. People were being killed. The three students, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, were killed in Mississippi trying to register people to vote. That's when the dogs and hoses were turned on the young people in Birmingham, Alabama. It was just all happening around me, that milieu, which I never would have appreciated. I also taught journalism at the college where I was head of their public relations bureau. And the students that I had could not put a sentence together. They had gone to segregated schools in Alabama. The white students were at the white Christian academies, as they call them, and the Black kids were left to the public schools. They didn't have teachers with certification. Somebody who finished 8th grade could become a teacher and teach others. And, you know, they called people, Black people, stupid and ignorant and all of those awful words, but there was a reason for that. And it was segregation, not being allowed to have the books and to have the buses and to have all the other things that would make going to school a pleasure. So when I realized, I mean, I had to start at the beginning with what a verb was, what adjective was, what a subject was, to get them to be able to finish my little journalism class. But you know, those remnants of segregation, they're still there. It's covert. It's not outward like you know, but you know those places where you still can't go or shouldn't go. And I experienced it as a reporter, covering stories in all the deep South states.
How do you think that impacted your reporting, that experience?
Well, it was a fantastic experience because I could understand, you know, the civil rights movement was so big, it was the big national story. So all the best reporters from New York and Washington were covering Dr. King, but they didn't know what it was like to be in the North like I was in an integrated situation, and then to go South and really know what these people were experiencing. They saw the things that Dr. King was arrested and so on, but all the other awful slights and humiliations that people had to suffer there. So I think it made me more sensitive to the good white people that are still there, that are still around, and the suffering that my people had to go through to get as far as we've come. And people think, well, we haven't gotten that far. Well, no, because segregation still exists, racism still exists. So I was hoping, after I saw all that Black people put themselves through to ignite the civil rights issue in this country, that it would be over with, but sadly it's not. And it makes me very angry and very sad.
Yeah, and I know you have a blog, right? And these are some of the topics that you talk about. I know you're retired, but you never retired from being a journalist, right?
No, it's a shame because CNN and MSNBC, only those two news networks, are in my house all the time, all day long. They're going because I am a news junkie. If I go places, if I've traveled overseas and I can't get the news of what was happening in America, I would go crazy. I was like a drug addict without a fix. I have to have that fix of news. So I still, you know, have to know what's going on everywhere. And I have to form my opinions. I'll have my own opinions about them. Too bad I couldn't do that when I was coming along. Like now, reporters are allowed to give their opinions. I would have liked to have done that, but so I listened to them, and you know, the worst thing about it is I wish I were out there. I'm 82 years old. I wanted to be at January 6th. I wanted to be covering that story at the Capitol. That was my workplace. I was crying when they attacked the Capitol because I used to go there for 4 years every day, and to see what was happening. And I wanted to be there to tell the story. Like I could have done much, but I do wish I had covered some of these stories. recently.
And so I know you've covered it from different mediums. You started as a newspaper reporter, like you said, starting in high school, asking different people questions, and then you switched to TV. So why make that switch?
Radio first.
Oh, radio first. Okay. So talk about what made you switch to broadcasting.
When I was at the University of Iowa working on my master's degree in journalism, I had a 2-hour hole in my schedule, and the only course that would fit in was a radio TV workshop. I said, what the heck? I'll try that. So I got in there, and the professor said, you've got a great voice. Why don't you try out for the radio station? And I appreciate these teachers that opened up other worlds to me that I had never considered, like journalism and like broadcasting. So I became the first woman. You left out one of my firsts. My whole career has been a series of firsts and only. Anyhow, I was the first woman to broadcast news at WSUI in Iowa City, Iowa.
Wow.
And I loved it because I still got to report and get the stories and feel it. Then I got to write it. And then I got to deliver it myself on the radio. And radio is a great medium. I love it because you don't have to worry about lights and cameras and all this other stuff, your makeup and your appearance and what clothes you got on, all those things that TV requires. As a radio journalist, you just go into that little control booth, that little soundproof booth, and talk into the microphone. And I felt I was talking to individual people out there, and it felt so intimate and so nice. So I miss radio, and I don't see the podcasts as being a substitute for what we used to have with doing newscasts on the radio.
Do you listen to any podcasts at all?
I do. I
Like
go to
what?
sleep on podcasts, try to help me go to sleep. And I'm not one of those true crime ones. I'm
Okay.
listening to the political ones.
Okay. And I know we have a couple of people that just joined us, so feel free to drop in some questions in the chat. That way we can bring them up. But Carole, I wanted to ask you one thing that I've heard a lot, especially coming up in the industry. I got my master's too in journalism, and that's one of the things I hear over and over again is you don't need one, you don't need one. What would you tell people about actually getting your master's?
There's no, you don't lose anything getting education. I think I was stronger. I got other, advanced writing classes and things that I didn't have as an undergraduate. So you probably don't, because they're looking for, unfortunately today, they're looking for looks, they're looking for voice, they're looking for presentation, and all those kinds of things. I don't hear anybody talking about, oh, this person went to Harvard and she got an advanced degree in international studies and we're going to have her cover international things. No, it's what these news directors look at. And which brings me to another point that I'm upset about. And that is what I call the sexploitation of news. I look at these women anchoring, and the weather women in particular, in these body conscious dresses that are skin tight as they give the weather, and they're reaching around and their bosoms are showing. Sometimes there's cleavage. And it was, when I was anchoring, we wore suits. They were pretty suits. It wasn't looking like men, but we had nice, pretty suits. Do you see a woman in a suit anymore? Hardly. So I have to tell you this story. It was a girl I know who went to Connecticut to, she'd been hired by a local station there. And her first day on the job, the news director had her in his office explaining to her things and how the day goes and so on. And while they were talking, he asked her, have you ever thought of getting breast implants? I see your mouth open. I see you drop your mouth because Can you imagine? Can you imagine? So they like the sweaters, and it's just very frustrating to me that all the things that I wanted to accomplish as a journalist, and I think those of us that came out in the 60s, we wanted to change things. We wanted people to understand what the issues and problems were, because then there could be solution. So I was starting my career with the assassination of King, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, the Democratic Convention of 1968, the Vietnam War protests. I mean, the country was embroiled. I mean, not since the 60s. I think this resembles the 60s in the country being, there was rich against poor and white against black and young against old. Talk about the country being torn apart. And so I just, we wanted to make things better in our country. All this talk about democracy, I don't know how many reporters, local reporters, or even network correspondents really understand how our government works, what the three branches of government, why we were set up this way, and what the Constitution and what the amendments are about. They don't know. And the public doesn't know. So we're in a hell of a fix if you've got a media that doesn't really understand and try to help the people. But the people, what are we doing? Amusing ourselves to death. Students are not reading newspapers. They're on their phones. They're TikToking and they're Twittering, and there's no, it doesn't seem evident to me that there's any concern among the major population, the majority of the population, about what is going on in our country. What can we do to help it? How can we serve it? There's none of that. It's all about entertainment and games and sports. No, I get really depressed. You got me talking, and now I'm really depressed. Okay.
I am so sorry, but
All
I mean,
over again.
Just talking about that, I mean, what are some of the basics that you think people, you kind of touched on it already, people, one of the things that you mentioned was that people don't really understand what they're covering necessarily. So can you kind of talk about the importance of getting to the basics of reporting?
Yes, but who's teaching it? Are these kids even getting it when they're picked up off the streets because they're pretty and, oh, we'll make you an anchor woman? Now that I'm retired and I watch lots of news and I watch local news, I hear so many mistakes. I hear so many grammatical errors. I see so many chyrons with things misspelled. Boy, we had editorial producers that oversaw our scripts and what the chyrons said under people's names and stuff. Somebody was overseeing that, because the desire was, we're the news media. We have to be accurate with everything we do. The name, the spellings, and the history and whatever. And there were people to check up on that. Not anymore. Do you have it at your station?
I don't have mine. It's the
You don't-
producers that do that.
The producers do that, right? And the producers probably, have they ever reported?
Some of them, I think they have, but for the most part, they produce their entire careers.
That's right. And producers that would send me out to cover a story, who have never been out there before, telling me what I need to get and what I need to, I was having none of it. You don't know what I'm going through. You don't know how hard this story is to cover. They sit in the, confines of their newsroom and with heat and air conditioning and light and food. And we're out there knocking ourselves out trying to get a story. Well, why didn't you get this? Or why didn't you get that? I found my voice with other news people and bosses when I was about 40. You've got a while, don't you, before you hit 40?
Just a little bit.
A little bit. When you get about 40, 35 to 40, you start looking around and going, these people are not that smart. You know, I'm as smart as they are. Why am I feeling that, oh, all wisdom resides in these producers and news directors and so on? I have my own ideas of how the news should be covered and how I want this story to go and how I should tell the story. And so I spoke back, you know, I would like, no, that's not the way to tell it. No, I don't want to put that person in the piece. We need this person. So I would fight for what I believed would be the best story that the public could understand, some issue or problem.
And so your whole career has been filled with different obstacles, right? You talked about how being a Black woman has impacted you, how, lack of an experience when you first started has impacted you. So back in 1965, after the Watts riots, you were hired at, is it WCFL in Chicago, right? And you became the first woman to broadcast news there. One of
This was radio. This was radio.
Okay.
Let me tell you, you want to hear about the sexism part? Told you a lot about the racism. When I was working in local radio, I used to do the 9 o'clock newscast. It was a big 100,000 watt rock and roll station, but it had a big news department. You're talking about, we had 13 reporters at this radio station. Well, Chicago's a big town, a lot's going on there. But I was to do the 9 o'clock news. And then after I finished, I would hit the streets and cover the stories I'd been assigned. When I first got there, it was an all-male staff, and they were not thrilled that I was there. And so some of them went about trying to sabotage me. One time when I went, I would take my script and go into the broadcasting studio, and it was a small room. And in the middle of a newscast, one guy opened the door and mooned me. His big butt was sticking in the door in the middle of my newscast. And you know, I could have screamed. I could have just did something that people on the air would hear me, but I realized I'm on the air. I can't do anything about this. So he just kept shaking his butt in my face while I'm trying to finish the newscast. Another time, the door opened and someone threw a big rubber spider, tarantula, on the desk. I cannot stand spiders, but here's this tarantula right on my script. And what do? Again, I steeled myself and got through the newscast. Another time, a guy came in, and they always come in when I'm on the air. I can't stop them or anything, and I don't know what's going to happen. He snatched the rest of my newscast out of my hand. I had read 2 pages of it. He snatched the rest of the newscast out of my hand, the script. So now what do? And I have nothing. Fortunately, I had read and all the wires about these stories, and I had written the newscast. So I had facts that I could draw on. So I said, repeating our top story, and I just started reading the first story over again and adding some things that I remembered from the piece. And the second, I was reading so slowly, and the weather this last was so slow, and that's the news. And I'm Carole Simpson. I mean, that took forever, but I got through it. Now, what they ended up doing is again preparing me for being a good broadcaster, because nothing could rattle me. I was used to people trying to make me look bad, and I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. So I just powered my way through. But it was awful. I had men reach down inside of my blouse and grab my breast. I had them pull my skirt up over my head in the newsroom where everybody was. I had them say the most incredible things of what they wanted to do to me. And usually right before I was to go on and record something, right before I was to do a spot on the air. So it was pretty tragic. I don't know that any of that happens anymore because it's so blatant. But the sexism is still there too. Somehow you're just not quite as good as that white man, but they feel the pressure from women to give them opportunities. And that's why we have a Nora O'Donnell doing the CBS Evening News. And so I don't know. It's a mixed bag. I fear we're going to slide backwards. I gave a speech at the Washington Press Club where you said I received the Lifetime Achievement Award. And my message was to the women that I see signs that some of the progress we have is starting to erode. And if things like Roe v. Wade being overturned and contraception being denied, those things coming along, it's going to have a big impact on women's ability to have careers and to make the wonderful contributions they're making today.
And so just listening to those, awful things that were said to you and awful things that were done to you, what made you want to stay in TV or, in news?
Because they tried to get me out. I told you those were like those things that said no to me. No, I'm gonna get you upset and you're gonna want to leave here because you're gonna be so upset. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. I would not. You're not driving me out. I'm going to show you. And I had to work twice as hard and do, work longer and all those kinds of things to prove that I was up to the job. So I hope the young women today that are in news understand the sacrifices that many of us had to make in the 70s, the 60s and 70s to open the way for them. I always wanted more women to come along, more women. But then I don't know why they're wearing these body conscious dresses. You know what I'm talking about, don't you?
Yes, I work in TV, so I've seen it.
And they're short, they're getting shorter and shorter. What is that about? That's not about the weather.
And so I want to talk about some of the, you've talked about some of the challenges, to put it very lightly, that you faced, but I want to talk about some of the work that you've done. You've gotten a lot of scoops over your career. And in '66, you got one of your big scoops when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Chicago. Can you talk about that and what happened?
It's a long story. How much time do we have?
Well, we got 30 minutes, and I want to make sure to hit everything. So as briefly as you can tell us. But
Well, it was 65 when I had joined the radio station, and being the Black woman, my news director came to me and said, "We hear Dr. Martin Luther King's coming to Chicago. He's going to mount some kind of civil rights campaign in Chicago. Why would he come here? This isn't the segregated South. So we're going to put you on that story." Well, of course, nobody else wanted to cover the story, but I did because it was Dr. King. And in my mind, even back then, he was a hero of major proportions. So I said, okay. They got the information that he was arriving on a Delta flight at O'Hare Airport at a certain time, 4:15, say. And so all the news media, all, including national media, because what was this? Why is Dr. King going to Chicago? It had not been announced. So everybody was there, all waiting at the gate where he was supposed to arrive. And of course, all the people get off and there's no Dr. King, all these cameras and people are where is he? And so one of the ticket counter employees said he was taken off the plane in the back and he was driven off the tarmac in a car with his party. Great. So here are all the reporters is like, oh, where is he going? Where is he gonna go? And so we're talking among ourselves, and somebody said he'll probably go to the Palmer House, which was a hotel in downtown Chicago where he had stayed before when he had made trips to Chicago. So everybody said, let's go there. So they all tromped down to the Palmer House. And I'm thinking, well, I'm not going to go where they are. And I don't believe he's going to go a place they might guess that he might be. I bet you he's going to stay around this airport. And that was just a hunch that I had. I was thinking like they didn't want to have the long motorcade down into Chicago. So he must be staying around the airport. So there must have been about 8 at that time, hotels and motels around O'Hare Airport. So I started going one by one into each of these hotels. I was so young and stupid. I would go in and say, is Dr. Martin Luther King registered here? And of course I should have known if they wouldn't tell me that. They wouldn't tell me. So anyhow, I kept going. I must have gone through 6. I was getting toward the end of those motels that were left. So I went in what I think was the 6th of 7. And I said, is there a party of Black people here? I'm looking to join up with them. I was supposed to meet them here. And the way the desk clerk looked, I knew he was here. I just, again, another hunch. I bet he's here. And of course, the clerk said, no, there's no one here. There's no party of Black people. I said, okay, fine. So when that desk clerk wasn't looking, I went to the bank of elevators and I took the floors up. And in those days, you didn't have this bank of elevators and that bank of elevators. There was just one group of elevators going through the center of the hotel. So I opened it on 2, looked up and down the hall, no activity. I went up to 3, up and down the elevator, nothing. 4, I go up each of the floors. I think it was a 10-story hotel, and I got to about floor 7. And I peeked out, holy cow, there were all these Black people down at the end of one of the corridors. Again, it was just a flat hotel, just a rectangle. So there weren't these things going off to other sides. It was just that way and that way. And I see all these people at one end. I'm going, this is it. I know this is it. So I got off the elevator. It was wintertime. It was January. So I had a big coat and I looked and I said, oh my God, that's Reverend Ralph Abernathy. I started recognizing some of these people when I got a little closer. So I went up to what looked like a bodyguard, some guy standing there blocking the hallway. And I said, sir, I'm a reporter with WCFL radio here in Chicago, and I'd like to get an interview with Dr. King. And he looked at me and laughed. Dr. King is not talking to anybody. I said, well, could somebody just ask? Could somebody try? No, young lady, you better go ahead. Then they had somebody come out that must have been a PR person who was up and about an hour after I had confronted this first guy. And he came out and he said, young lady, I understand you're here wanting to see Dr. King. He's going to have a news conference at 10 o'clock tomorrow at such and such place. And, everything, he'll talk to everybody there. And I said, but couldn't I just get a jump on them? Couldn't I just get him to myself first? And they were like, no, you'll learn with everybody else. So I was like, he's got to get out of this hotel by these elevators. There were no other elevators. So I decided to plunk myself down at the bank of elevators. And I had some newspapers with me. I think I had some Ritz crackers in my purse. I always, as a reporter, traveled with food in my purse. I had coins for the telephone. We had no cell phones or anything. We had to use the pay phones. I had quarters for that. Maybe they were dimes. I don't know. And I decided I'm staying here. So about midnight, one of the men came and said, "Are you still here?" And I said, "Yep, I'm waiting until I can see Dr. King." And he said, "Okay." And he went back, and then everything started hushing, doors were closing, people were going to sleep. So there I am on this cold concrete floor, even though I had a winter coat, it was cold. And I'm trying to ration my crackers so I'd have something through the night. And that was just an awful night, waiting there, waiting. I mean, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. It just was the longest night of my life. And then at about 7:30, I see doors starting to open. Going, okay, this is it. They're going to leave. I'm going to get him. And so I tried to press out the wrinkles on my clothes and had my tape recorder, and I got my makeup, my compact, and I put some powder on my nose and a little lipstick. I try to press my hair down and look presentable. And so people start coming. And I'm looking for Dr. King. And he's a short man. I didn't realize he was as short as he was. And so in that crowd kind of parted. It was like the seas parted, and I could see him. And I was like, oh my God, it's Dr. King. I can't believe I'm looking at Dr. King. And it was like he had a halo around him. He just stood out from all the rest of the people. And he kind of looked at me, and I was standing off to the side as they were coming toward the elevators. And he came over to me. I was going to knock people down if I had to try to get him. But he came over to me and he said, "Are you the young lady they've been telling me about?" And I said, "What have they been telling you?" And they said that you've been here all night and that you're waiting to see me. I said, "Yes, Dr. King, I know you're having a press conference, but I'm the first colored girl reporter in Chicago. And it would be so great if you could give me a little scoop on it before everybody else. It could make my career." I was so blatant. And he said, "Let me whisper in your ear." I'm going, "Oh, Dr. King is whispering in my ear. You don't understand. This was like my rock star." So he whispers in my ear, "I'm going to challenge the regime of Mayor Richard J. Daley, and I'm going to raise the issue of segregated housing in the city of Chicago. There isn't just segregation in the South. There is segregated housing in Chicago." And then he said, "Now don't tell anyone." And I laughed and he laughed. And I said, "Okay, Dr. King, okay, thank you very much." I knew I had it. And so he got into the elevator and he stepped back and he said, "Young lady, I admire your perseverance. I expect great things of you someday." Well, what do you think? I was on cloud 9. My feet were off the ground. Dr. King has said this about me. And I had to get out of my my mental state and get to the telephone. And I called in. I said, "Put me on the air now. I've got it. I just talked to Dr. King directly." And so the radio station I worked for was a part of Mutual Broadcasting System, which is another network like ABC and CBS and so on. So they got the network on. I was all over the nation. They just opened it up for me. Carole Simpson in Chicago has got news of what Dr. King is doing. As I told you, it was the question everybody wanted to know. So I got on and just ad-libbed the story of what he had said, and that he was going to have a news conference, and I expected I would be there to give them more details of what he had told me. Well, the wires picked it up that my station and I had broken this story on. I mean, it was a huge scoop, and it was amazing. The euphoria that I felt was like nothing I think I've experienced again. And I went to the news conference. Everybody was going, "Who's Carole Simpson?" I'd hadn't been working for that long. Who's this that broke the story? And how do we know it? So I go walk into the news conference, and everybody's looking at me and pointing to me and so on, wondering how I had gotten this story. And when Dr. King came to the podium, he saw me in the crowd of reporters standing around, and he did this to me, gave me a thumbs up. And so that's my Dr. King story.
Is that the time you've interviewed him?
Yes, I never got to interview him again. And it wasn't exactly an interview, it was a whisper.
And so two things stood out to me in that story. I mean, the persistence, perseverance, like Dr. King mentioned, and also the fact that you went there, because I feel like a lot of people now, especially after COVID, they feel like they can just report from their desk, right? They can just make calls, but that story in itself proves the importance of being there.
You have to be there. You have to be there. You know, that reminds me that you're saying that people are doing that. I can't believe the quality of the news we're getting today is going to be as good as if you're there. Right?
Yeah.
So that concerns
you probably wouldn't have gotten that if you were just calling your hotels.
No.
Or you wouldn't have gotten it. It's not that you probably wouldn't have, you wouldn't have.
But as I say, I don't know what it was. When you say a hunch, is that providence? Is that fate? Was it supposed to be? Because I don't know why I didn't go with the rest of them. I was such a green reporter, but I just had a feeling.
So we have about 13 minutes left, and I don't want to keep you too long. So we're going to kind of speed date for the rest of the last couple of minutes. So
you don't have any questions from anyone? No one
I haven't seen any in the chat unless I missed them. No, I don't have any. So if you guys have questions, please drop them in the chat. One of the things I want to talk about, because obviously we know you went to network, and that was, I mean, it was monumental, right?
It was what?
Monumental.
Yes, but I had turned out to be, that story got me to TV. I mean, my name was out there now and people were looking at me. And I had the voice because I was already on radio. So the NBC local station called me and asked if I would come and be a reporter there. And so I was, and I anchored the weekend news at the local station. And then the network, 4 years after I was doing that, they called me and said, "Would you like to go to Washington?" Which was my dream, because now it's stories that affect everybody. It's not something in your local viewing audience. This is stuff that affects everyone. So that was my dream job, was to go to Washington and be able to cover the White House and Congress and things like that. I mean, that's why I know how government works, because I had to cover it. I'm not sure I got it in school, but we damn well should be teaching civics to all of our children and to adults. I mean, it should be as basic as math and reading, where we live and what's at stake here and what is going on. So I taught civics when I was a teacher at Emerson College, and the kids were telling me they never got it. They never knew what the 3 branches of government were. They didn't know the history of our country. They probably were given it, but they weren't paying attention. The other thing I think we've got to do is teach children media literacy, because people are picking up, they think everything's the news. If they hear it on TikTok, that's the news. The Wall Street Journal is the news. ABC World News Tonight is the news. Oprah was the news when I was coming along, when she had her show on. because Entertainment Tonight was the news. And they've got to be able to distinguish between what is, alternative programming and what are the facts. And I would say the networks are still doing the job of trying to present nothing but the facts and are double checked and all those kinds of things. But the public doesn't trust us anymore. And thank you, Donald Trump, for that, for making us the enemy and make people hate us. It's so bad. It's so wrong. I don't know how we're going to restore that. But it'll be on you because I'll be gone. So you all will have to figure it out.
So kind of a segue, since you brought up a former president, you were the first woman and first person of color to moderate a presidential debate back in 1992. I mean, I think you're one of 3 women to ever do that, correct? And I mean, that's a milestone. I mean, how did that define?
Actually, let's see.
Because I know that Kristen Welker is most recent.
Oh, and Candy Crowley did one from CNN. That's 3. That's it.
So, I mean, how big of a milestone was that for you and for women in journalism?
It was big.
And it was the first town hall style too, right?
Yes, it was something they were going to try for the first time, and to have the audience ask questions of the candidates, which I thought was great. They're the ones that are going to be voting, and let's hear what their questions are, because they certainly weren't what the news medias were. We had Clinton and Ross Perot and George H.W. Bush, the father, George Bush, the father, and he was the president. I had covered both Clinton and George Bush, and the campaigns had to agree on the person that would be a moderator. Their campaigns had to agree. So since I had covered them both, they were comfortable with my being given that job. There hadn't been any pressure that I know of, and it's been a long time now, but I don't think there was pressure that we'd got to get a minority in here moderating a presidential debate. I really think it was because they thought at that time I was anchoring the weekend news. They knew who I was. I'd been a reporter for a long time on NBC and ABC. And so I was a known commodity. So it was shocking to ABC when they asked if I could moderate the presidential debate. And I'm sure if the campaigns had gone to ABC, ABC would not have suggested me to be the first person that would get that debate. It would be Peter Jennings or Barbara Walters or Ted Koppel, all of those people I worked with. And so they were the stars. I was not a star on the weekend news. But anyhow, I got it. And it was the most thrilling experience I had. I had 3 candidates, not just the 2 that typically you would have in a debate. I had the independent candidate, Ross Perot. So in the 5 days I had to prepare, and that's all I had was 5 days, I had to learn everything about Richmond, Virginia, where the voters were going to be who would ask the questions. I needed to know everything about each of their positions on all of the major issues of the day. I was studying, I was reading. They finally gave me a research assistant to help prepare me because I was concerned they're ordinary people, and with all these cameras and all this pressure, maybe they'll freeze. So I got to have questions to be able to pick it up if something like that were to happen. So I was a nervous wreck until I went in and met the voters who were going to be asking the questions. These were 200 undecided voters from the Richmond, Virginia area. So I walked onto the stage. I wanted to meet them. I wanted to see them. I wanted to try to relax them. And I came out on the stage and they were all going, Carole Simpson, and they were clapping and clapping. And I'm going, oh, these folks are going to be great. So I had a lot of fun with them, warming them up. And I don't want to know your questions. They all wanted to tell me that I don't want to know your questions. I don't want to hear them. But try not to read them because that's kind of boring if you have to read it. I was coaching them like that. So once I began, there were 10 cameras in there, and I was in the center of the room with the 3 candidates in front of me. And when they said, go, I went, and it was 90 minutes nonstop. There was no water, there was no bathroom breaks, there was nothing. It was constant 90 minutes of questioning. Some of the toughest things, I mean, to keep track of what they were all saying. And the Bipartisan Commission on Presidential Debates had told me my job was to make sure the voters got their questions answered by the candidates, to make sure that not to let one candidate have more time than another one. And all of those things I'm trying to juggle and think about the questions. And I had nothing to do with who was picked. In my ear was the director who would say, go to the lady in green. They were trying to mix up the audience, and go to the lady in the green on your right. And so I would move like Oprah did in her old show. That's what they wanted, was something like that. And then go to the man with the ponytail. He's got on a brown sweater. And so I had no choice of who asked questions, but I was criticized. I was lambasted by Republican right-wingers. They said that I gave Clinton the debate, that I was hard on George Bush and I let Clinton just slide. Clinton was great. He just knows how to do that. And George Bush, whom I loved because I had covered him a lot, he's more stiff and wooden and doesn't come across as warm as Clinton did. But it was all my fault that Clinton won the debate. So there were death threats. After that debate was over, I had bodyguards for a week. I was terrified because, well, I understand what these people are going through now, like Dr. Fauci and people that have to have bodyguards now, given the political violence.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on an hour. Are you okay if we answer? We have 3 questions. You want to just go ahead and answer them all?
Sure.
Perfect. Okay. So the first question is from Cindy Alexander. She asked, what is the most memorable story you've reported on with the exception of the Dr. King story?
The release of Nelson Mandela from prison in South Africa. I was part of the Nightline crew that went down there. And I ended up getting beaten up by the South African police. I was in a crowd of people that were at Archbishop Tutu's church, Anglican church in the middle of Johannesburg. And while they were in there celebrating the idea that the next day Mandela would be released, we didn't know that the South African police had encircled the church. And when people came out in jubilation, boy, was that a rude awakening. They started getting beat, and I got beaten on the back with one of those long rubber truncheons. There were people bleeding on the street. It was horrible, horrible, horrible. And I'm not in the United States. I'm in another country where apartheid is alive and well. And it was just so frightening. The ABC has sent some people to get me out of the crowd. I was to go to a certain place because I was crying and hurting, and they took me to a doctor, and he examined me, and I had been hit across the kidneys, and we were going to have to watch that. But the next day he was going to be released, so I had to be ready to go, and I was. And that was thrilling to see him walk out of the prison and to do the reporting about that. Such, again, an international story that everyone was interested in around the world.
Yeah, that's a story, definitely. Oh, okay. The next question we have is from Laura De La Garza. She said, what advice do you have for someone who is a woman of color wanting to be an anchor? Do you think people have to look outside of the state before looking at local stations?
Look outside the state. Well, the state has, all the states have local stations, so no problem with you being in Illinois and applying for a job in Wisconsin. Or anywhere, California, whatever, if you're going to local news. It's an advantage if you know the area that you're going to be covering, but people are looking for good reporters, and that's the first thing. What are your skills? Are you good at what you do? So you have to be good at what you do, okay? Before you start seeking anchorhood, because anchors just read intros into reporters' packages. And the news is what the reporters bring to the broadcast. So you want to have good reporting skills before you try to be an anchor. You got to know what it's like to be out there and have covered these things. So you have some context for if you're doing a weather story on snowstorms. I mean, you've been out there and you knew what it was like and how you doing out there. So the most important thing is to write well and to be able to report and report it well and different than everybody else. And then you want to try for anchorhood. But that means you've got to have a reel with some real solid stories on there that a news director can look at.
I will say all the best anchors I've worked with, they were reporters, and they're mentors in the newsroom.
Yes.
Okay. And then the other question, you mentioned you watch CNN a lot. And I know one of the things that they get a lot of flack for is constantly using the phrase breaking news. The question we got from Alan is the phrase breaking news permeates news even when it broke 12 hours before. What do you think is driving it? And do you think it's reversible?
No, because, the remote control changed everything, changed television watching. Most people, I remember growing up and nobody wanted to change the channel. So you stayed on one channel because you didn't want to have to get up out of your nice seat and go change the channel. So people usually would look at a program, and whatever that program was, whatever news followed it, they'd watch that news. But the remote control made it possible for you to click along, and see what other people are doing. And I have heard news directors say, we're in competition with entertainment. So if they click and see a beautiful woman, on some sitcom, we need to have a beautiful woman or a handsome man that maybe might snag people and make them stop and watch our news. Terrible idea, but that is what has happened. And they've made a science of watching how these clicks, when people change the channel, what it is that sparked them to change it. One of the things they found out that every time it went to news about Israel or Bosnia, people would click the channel and go look for something else. So I don't think we can change. We can change that. So I think what CNN is doing, saying breaking news, is they think you have switched from something else and you're just coming to CNN. So we've got breaking news and maybe you'll stop and listen to it there. I think that's the thinking behind it, but it's ridiculous.
Because I've seen the same thing with NBC Nightly News. Like, I work weekends and, we'll run something at Saturday night at 10. And then the next day, Sunday at 5, we'll see something that was breaking news that we're like, wait, we just ran this in our newscast.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. So I wanted to touch on just the two last things. So one of the things you've talked about how important.
Last things, you asked me if I wanted to answer the last 3 questions.
I promise you'll want to answer these ones. So one of the things that, you've done is you've created scholarships for supporting women of color. How important is that for you?
It's very, very, very important because I try to put my money where my mouth is. And when I say I want more women and more ethnic minorities in the newsroom, I think we're only stronger when you get different perspectives and different people to to talk about things. I remember one Sunday we were doing the news in Washington, and it came across the wire that Tejano music singer Selena has been shot and killed by a fan in San Antonio, Texas, or something like that. So we're reading this, and it's like, I'd never heard of her. Tejano music, I had no idea what that was. Everybody around our rim, all the producers and the executive producer, and so we had no idea how big this story was. So we started going around the day. Nobody was assigned to go get it, go there and cover it, or get the affiliate to cover it for us. So the day wears on, and this story's getting bigger and bigger, and there are now thousands of people in LA crowding into the Coliseum, and girls were crying outwardly on the streets of San Antonio. And we're still like, I said, we need some Hispanics here. Somebody needs to tell us what this story is. We called LA. Surely in LA, we've got a Hispanic that can explain this. No, we didn't. New York, nobody knew what it was. So then we had to start looking it up, and I think we ended up with some video of a candlelight vigil, just a little video. I think they found a picture of her, and that's what we did, a voiceover of this huge star and this huge story that none of us knew, because we didn't have anyone to tell us this is big. This is really big. So I like very much when people that are Polish or Jewish or Muslim say, no, you don't want to do this. You don't want to say that. They need to be around the table. They need to be in the room where it happens. And so I decided that if I say we need to have more people like that, I need to do my part to help make that possible. So I started, I have 5 scholarships. I have one at the University of Michigan. All of these are for women and minorities. I have the RTNDA, I have 2 with them. I have 2 with the National Association of Black Journalists. And I have, did I say the University of Michigan?
Yeah.
I have 5 of them. So anyhow, I have been supporting these young people, and I call them my puppy dogs, and it thrills me that they are now anchors, that they're producers, they're news directors, they're all kinds of people in the business today. And I can look at them and feel I helped make that true. I helped. I may be a little, but I helped. Because when I leave this planet, I want it to be said that she tried to make a difference. And I did try to make a difference. And I'm grateful for the young woman that replaced me, Lindsay Davis, on ABC. I look at all of the young minority women that are anchoring and holding down fantastic jobs, and I'm filled with pride because they're good, they're solid. And maybe I helped open the door a little bit for them to come through. And I hope women will continue to do that. But you know what they say about women, we're our own worst enemies. Got to stop that stuff. The women of ABC, we got together, put aside our little petty differences, and really challenged ABC to hire women for jobs that were forbidden them before. So it's working together, and I hope anybody that's looking at this, the women that will look at this, that you get together, put aside that mess. It's just mess. Something bigger at stake.
Yeah.
Did that make any sense? I don't know. I've been talking for an hour. I don't know if I'm making any sense.
No, that made perfect sense. And I thank you for doing that. And I promise this is the last question. What do you want? I promise. What do you want your legacy to be?
All these people that are now in these jobs, that I've been called a history maker. I'm one of the African-American history makers. And those are people that have made history and have opened the way for others. So that's what I want it to be, that again, she tried to make a difference, and I did.
Thank you so much, Carole Simpson. Thank you so much for spending the past 70 minutes with us. And I enjoyed every second of talking to you, and I learned so much from you. And the biggest thing for me was the power of persistence and being there and always making sure that your voice is heard.
Exactly. Well, it's nice to talk to you, Daniela.
Thank you so much.
Regards to the Society for Professional Journalists for having this forum and others like it.
Thank you so much. Well, I hope to see you again soon.
Okay.
All right.
Never know when or where.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good
Bye.
night.